I was standing in my dress blues, two silver stars gleaming on my shoulders, when my own mother threw a pashmina over me and whispered, "Please don't embarrass us." To them, I wasn't a decorated major general who had survived combat. I was just their personal ATM, the ugly secret they had to hide in the back corner at my sister's high society wedding. But they had no idea who the groom really was, or the blood-stained namitape he had been carrying in his pocket for 3 years. Today's story revealed why you can never buy the respect of a toxic family, and why having the courage to walk away is the ultimate victory. It is a powerful reminder that true family isn't determined by bloodlines, but by unwavering loyalty, empathy, and unconditional respect. If you've ever had to fight to be seen and valued in your own home, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of incredible resilience. Now, let's begin. The silence in the apartment was absolute, broken only by the steady, mechanical blinking of the answering machine on the kitchen counter. Sarah Harrison stood in the doorway, the heavy canvas of her duffel bag still slung over one aching shoulder. She had just returned from a grueling 48-hour strategic command briefing, her body humming with the residual adrenaline of high-stakes military logistics. But standing in her own home, stripped of her rank and her uniform, she felt an entirely different kind of exhaustion setting in. It was a bone-deep weariness that only flared up when she saw the caller ID flashing on the small digital screen. She dropped her keys onto the entryway table with a dull metallic clatter and pressed the play button. The machine beeped, and immediately, the small space was filled with the meticulously polished, honey-sweet voice of her mother, Eleanor. "Sarah, darling," the voice crooned, though there was no real warmth behind the endearment. It sounded more like a strategic opening move. "I hope you're doing well out there in the desert, or wherever it is they have you stationed this month. Listen, sweetheart, we have a tiny emergency. Victoria's floral designer had to make some last-minute adjustments for the reception centerpieces. We simply must have the imported white orchids. You understand. The budget is just a tiny bit stretched at the moment. I know you're just sitting at that little guard shack out there, so you aren't really spending your salary anyway. You can certainly spare a little of your hazard bonus to make your sister's special day perfect. Be a dear and wire the funds by morning. Love you." The machine clicked off, leaving the apartment plunged back into a suffocating quiet. Sarah didn't move. She just stared at the blinking red light, feeling the familiar, heavy ache blooming in the center of her chest. Sitting at that little guard shack, Sarah was a major general in the United States Army. She had spent 2 decades proving her worth in the most unforgiving environments on Earth. She had commanded thousands of troops, overseen massive logistical operations in active combat zones, and earned medals that she kept hidden away in a velvet-lined box because they felt too heavy with the memories of the people she had lost. The hazard bonus her mother had so casually demanded was blood money. It was the compensation for nights spent awake listening to mortar fire, for the sand that permanently scarred her lungs, and for the times she had traded her own physical safety to pull her soldiers out of the fire. Yet to her family back in their pristine, gated community on the East Coast, she was nothing more than a glorified security guard with a suspiciously large bank account. With a trembling breath, Sarah walked over to her laptop. She opened her banking portal. The screen illuminated her tired face, highlighting the faint, jagged white scar that ran along her jawline, a souvenir from a roadside blast in Kabul that she had miraculously survived. She didn't want to send the money. Every instinct she possessed, every ounce of self-respect she had painstakingly built, screamed at her to close the laptop. But the little girl inside her, the one who had spent her entire childhood desperate for a single validating glance from a mother who only had eyes for her perfect younger sister, took over. If she paid for the orchids, maybe they would smile at her. Maybe they would offer her a real seat at the table. instead of treating her like a shameful secret. Sarah typed in the transfer amount, $10,000. She hit submit. The screen confirmed the transaction with a cheerful green checkmark. The money was gone, and with it, a piece of her dignity. She turned away from the desk and dragged her duffel bag into the bedroom. It was time to pack for the wedding. She didn't pack like a woman going to a celebration. She packed with the ruthless, methodical efficiency of a soldier preparing for a hostile deployment. She rolled her civilian clothes tightly, placing them into the canvas depths. Finally, she reached into the back of her closet and pulled out a heavy garment bag. Inside was her dress blues. The dark fabric was immaculate, the brass buttons polished to a mirror shine. Pinned to the chest was of ribbons and medals that told the story of a life lived in service to others, a life of unimaginable courage and sacrifice. She ran her calloused fingers gently over the cool metal of the silver star. She knew Eleanor would hate the uniform. Her mother had already sent 3 emails suggesting Sarah buy a pastel silk dress to blend in and avoid looking so aggressively masculine. But Sarah refused to leave it behind. It was her armor. She zipped the garment bag shut and laid it carefully on top of her clothes. She was walking into a battlefield where the weapons were not bullets, but whispered insults and devastatingly polite smiles. She was going to her sister's wedding, praying for a miracle, but fully prepared for a war. The air inside the Sterling Country Club was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, expensive champagne, and generations of inherited wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, glittering light over the rehearsal dinner, illuminating a room filled with politicians, real estate tycoons, and the upper echelon of high society. The gentle swell of a live string quartet playing Mozart attempted to drown out the low, constant hum of networking and gossip. Sarah stood near the arched entryway, feeling entirely out of place despite the flawless tailoring of her dark navy blazer and slacks. She had intentionally chosen something understated, hoping to fly under the radar. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and stepped onto the plush, crimson carpet. She hadn't made it 10 feet before Eleanor intercepted her. Her mother materialized from the crowd like a beautifully dressed phantom, wearing a flawless cream-colored silk wrap dress and a string of pearls that cost more than Sarah's first car. Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't open her arms for a welcoming embrace. Instead, she stepped close, invading Sarah's personal space, and let her pale blue eyes do a slow, agonizing scan from the top of Sarah's sensible bun down to her polished leather shoes. "Oh, sweetheart," Eleanor murmured, her voice pitched perfectly to ensure no one else could hear the venom. She offered a tight, pitying embrace, her cheek barely brushing Sarah's shoulder. "You wore those clunky boots. I know you prefer function over form, but really, it clashes dreadfully with the aesthetic. I specifically told the catering manager you were part of the security detail so they wouldn't be confused by your attire." Sarah's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking under her skin. "They are Dress Oxford's mother, and I am your daughter, not the hired help." Eleanor sighed, a delicate, exasperated sound, and patted Sarah's arm as if consoling a confused child. "Don't be so dramatic. Darling, it's just easier this way. James's family is very traditional. They are true military royalty. You know, generals and admirals. We don't want to embarrass them by parading you around and having to explain why you aren't wearing a proper dress. Come along. I've found you a nice, quiet spot." Eleanor turned her back, expecting Sarah to follow like an obedient dog. Sarah swallowed the bitter copper taste of humiliation and followed her mother through the maze of elegantly set tables. They bypassed the prime seating near the front, walked past the middle section, and didn't stop until they reached a small, poorly lit table wedged tightly into a back alcove, directly in the draft path of the kitchen's swinging double doors. Table 13, the overflow table, the containment zone. "Enjoy the evening," Eleanor chirped, already turning her attention to a wealthy hedge fund manager passing by. She walked away without looking back. Sarah pulled out the stiff wooden chair and sat down. The catering staff rushed past her, their elbows grazing her shoulder as they carried trays of appetizers. She kept her spine perfectly straight, her hands resting flat on her thighs. She didn't look down at the table, nor did she slouch in defeat. She kept her eyes up, scanning the room with the ingrained situational awareness of a combat veteran. She watched her sister, Victoria, laughing loudly at the VIP table, draped in designer silk and flashing a massive diamond ring. The view leaves a lot to be desired, doesn't it? Sarah blinked, her eyes snapping to the right. She hadn't realized someone else had been seated at the table. A man in his early 40s was sitting one chair over, swirling a glass of sparkling water. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, but there was an inherent ease about him that contrasted sharply with the stiff, pretentious posture of the other guests. He had warm, perceptive brown eyes and a face that looked like it had seen its fair share of long, difficult nights. "I prefer to keep the exits in my line of sight," Sarah replied evenly, her guard instantly up. The man smiled, a genuine, quiet expression that reached his eyes. "A tactical choice. I can appreciate that. I'm Arthur. Arthur Vance." He extended a hand. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. His grip was firm, warm, and remarkably gentle. "Sarah Harrison, the bride's sister," Arthur said, though his tone held no judgment. Only a mild curiosity. He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way her family hadn't done in decades. His eyes briefly caught the faint scar on her jawline. But he didn't stare. "You don't strike me as someone who enjoys these kinds of masquerades, Sarah." "I don't," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "But we do what we must for family." Before Arthur could reply, the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The room's chatter died down as a sharp, piercing sound echoed through the speakers, Victoria tapping her manicured fingernails against a brass microphone at the front of the room. A bright spotlight hit the bride-to-be, illuminating her like a Broadway star. "Thank you all so much for being here," Victoria began, her voice dripping with practiced charm. "James and I are just so blessed to be surrounded by our wonderful friends and this beautiful family." She gestured grandly to Eleanor, who beamed for the cameras. Then Victoria's eyes scanned the room, landing squarely on the dark corner where Sarah sat. A cruel, playful smirk touched Victoria's lips. "I even want to give a special shout-out to my older sister, Sarah," Victoria announced, leaning into the microphone so her voice boomed over the speakers. "We are just so glad she could take a break from checking IDs at the base gate to be here tonight. It's hard work playing security guard, but someone has to do it." A ripple of laughter swept through the ballroom. 50 people in tailored tuxedos and silk gowns chuckled politely at the wealthy bride's expense of her seemingly low-class sister. Sarah sat perfectly still in the shadows. She didn't flush. She didn't clench her fists. She simply absorbed the public humiliation the same way she had learned to absorb physical pain, by locking it away in a dark, silent box inside her mind. But Arthur Vance didn't laugh. Sarah felt his gaze on her. She turned her head slightly to look at him. Arthur's jaw was set tight, the muscles ticking rapidly. His warm brown eyes had turned hard, sweeping the room with a look of profound disgust before settling back on Sarah. He didn't offer her pity, and he didn't ask if she was okay. Instead, Arthur leaned slightly closer to her, his voice low and incredibly steady. "I have worked with a lot of people in my life, Sarah, and I can tell you right now, you don't look like a gatekeeper. You look like a woman who could burn this entire room to the ground if she wanted to." For the first time in years, sitting in the cold draft of the kitchen doors, surrounded by a family that despised her, Sarah felt something she thought she had lost entirely. She felt seen. The afternoon sun filtered through the towering stained glass windows of the historic cathedral, casting long, bruised shadows across the polished marble floors. Sarah Harrison stood in the vestibule, completely ignoring the frantic whispers of the wedding coordinator. She was not wearing pastel silk or a designer fascinator. She wore the dark, immaculate navy wool of her United States Army dress blues. The heavy brass buttons caught the dim light, and the rows of meticulously aligned ribbons on her chest spoke volumes of a life spent in the crucible of combat. Pinned to her shoulders were the heavy silver stars of a major general. She smoothed her calloused hands over the fabric, feeling the familiar, grounding weight of her uniform. This was her armor, and today, she would not hide in the shadows. Eleanor materialized from the bridal suite, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she took in her eldest daughter's appearance. She rushed forward, clutching a pale pink cashmere pashmina like a weapon. Without a word of greeting, she attempted to drape the heavy fabric over Sarah's shoulders, desperately trying to conceal the medals and the rank. Eleanor's voice was a frantic, venomous hiss, barely audible over the swelling organ music. She begged Sarah not to embarrass them in front of James's family, insisting that the Sterlings were actual military royalty and would find her outfit aggressively masculine and deeply inappropriate. Sarah simply reached up, grabbed her mother's wrist with a grip like a steel vise, and slowly removed the pashmina. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked down at Eleanor with cold, clinical detachment and stepped into the main sanctuary. The reception was held in the grand ballroom of the Alexandria Plaza, a cavernous space dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with the imported white orchids Sarah had paid for. Just as she had been the night before, Sarah was relegated to a dark corner near the kitchen doors. But this time, she did not feel isolated, Doctor. Arthur Vance was seated beside her once again, looking devastatingly sharp in a black tuxedo. He offered her a warm, knowing smile as she sat down, his eyes lingering on her silver stars with profound, unmistakable respect. The evening progressed with the usual agonizing forced cheerfulness. Victoria flaunted her massive diamond ring, parading James around the room as if he were a prized trophy rather than a husband. James looked handsome in his own formal military uniform, but he appeared tense, his eyes constantly scanning the room with the residual hypervigilance of a combat veteran. The turning point arrived when James's father, a formidable retired four-star general, stepped up to the brass microphone at the center of the room. The ballroom fell silent as the older man adjusted his glasses. He spoke eloquently about honor, duty, and the invisible burdens carried by those who serve. Then, he raised his champagne glass and asked every active duty military member in the room to stand and be recognized. Chairs scraped against the polished wooden floor. James stood up at the head table. A few cousins and uncles stood near the center, and in the dark back corner of the room, near the kitchen exhaust doors, Major General Sarah Harrison pushed back her chair and rose to her feet. She locked her spine, squared her shoulders, and stepped out of the shadows and directly into the harsh glare of the chandelier light. At the head table, James casually glanced around the room to acknowledge his fellow service members. His eyes swept past the politicians and the socialites, finally landing on the lone woman standing in the back. His gaze hit the dark blue wool, traveled up to the heavy silver stars, and locked onto the jagged white scar to her jawline. The breath was violently knocked out of his lungs. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him the color of wet ash. James did not politely applaud. His hands began to tremble. He reached inside the breast pocket of his uniform jacket and pulled out a small, charred, and blood-stained piece of fabric. It was a military tape. The faded black letters spelled out the name Harrison. For 3 years, James had carried that tape. It was the only piece of evidence he had of the masked convoy commander who had dragged his bleeding, broken body out of a burning Humvee in a hellish firefight overseas, taking a piece of shrapnel to the jaw to shield him from an incoming blast. He had never known her face, only her name and the ferocity of her courage. Without a word to his new bride, James kicked his chair back. He ignored Victoria's frantic, shrill questions. He marched down the steps of the dais, his boots hitting the floor with heavy, brutal force. The jazz band stopped playing. The entire ballroom fell into a dead, Pressurized silence as the groom strode past the wealthy elite and stopped exactly 2 paces in front of Sarah. He brought his heels together with a sharp crack, snapped his right hand up to his brow in a flawless, rigid salute, and bowed his head. His voice cracked with raw, desperate reverence as it echoed through the silent room, calling her ma'am, and announcing to the stunned crowd that the woman they had shoved into the corner was the guardian angel who had traded her flesh for his life. The silence that slammed down on the ballroom was absolute and suffocating. At the front of the room, Victoria dropped her sham flute, the crystal shattering against the hardwood floor. Panic, raw and ugly, twisted her perfectly contoured features. She realized instantly that the narrative she had carefully spun, the lie that her sister was an insignificant security guard, was disintegrating before her eyes. Desperate to maintain control, Victoria lunged toward the microphone, her voice shrill and trembling. She attempted to laugh off the revelation, stuttering that they had only kept Sarah's rank a secret to protect her privacy, framing her family's cruelty as a noble act of protection. Simultaneously, Eleanor executed a flawless, chilling pivot. The woman who had just tried to hide her daughter beneath a scarf suddenly stepped forward, pasting a radiant, tearful smile onto her face. She clasped her hands over her heart, acting the part of the fiercely proud military mother, ready to bask in the reflected glory of the hero she had spent a lifetime degrading. Before Eleanor could utter a single hypocritical word, Dr. Arthur Vance pushed his chair back and stood up. He did not yell, but his deep, authoritative voice carried effortlessly across the silent room. He introduced himself not as a wedding guest, but as the former military trauma surgeon stationed at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and held it up. He informed the room that 3 years ago, he was the lead surgeon who spent 12 hours pulling shrapnel out of General Harrison's jaw and stabilizing her shattered ribs after she saved Captain Sterling. Arthur's eyes locked onto Eleanor, cold and unrelenting. He recounted the exact phone call he had made to her while Sarsa was lying in a medically induced coma. He repeated Eleanor's words verbatim, exposing to the entire room that a mother had refused to board a military flight to sit by her critically wounded daughter's bedside because it conflicted with a charity gala at the country club. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd, the wealthy socialites and politicians, who had been laughing at Victoria's cruel jokes just an hour earlier, now stared at the mother and bride with unadulterated revulsion. The illusion of the perfect, aristocratic family shattered entirely. James turned to look at Victoria, his eyes filled with a mixture of horror and profound betrayal. He realized that the woman he had just married had used the hazard pay of the hero who saved his life to buy her imported orchids and designer silk. The deception was absolute. James did not scream or cause a scene. He simply turned his back on his bride, a gesture of military precision and total dismissal. General Sterling, James's father, stepped down from the dais. He bypassed his son and walked directly to Eleanor and Victoria. The older man possessed the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who had commanded armies. He did not raise his voice. He leaned in, his tone impeccably polite but laced with pure steel, and informed Eleanor that the Sterling family placed honor and integrity above all else. He stated that their presence was an insult to the uniform his son wore and the sacrifices General Harrison had made. With brutal civility, he asked the mother and sister of the bride to leave the reception immediately. Eleanor's flawless mask finally cracked. She burst into tears, her face flushing a deep, mottled red as the humiliation she had spent her life avoiding crashed down upon her. Victoria sobbed hysterically, her manicured hands reaching out for James. But the groom refused to even look in her direction, guided by the venue's security staff. The two women were escorted out of the ballroom, their frantic protests echoing faintly before the heavy wooden doors clicked shut. James turned back to Sarah, tears streaming down his own face, and offered a broken, whispered apology for his family's ignorance. Sarah looked at the young man she had saved, the heavy burden of her past finally lifting from her shoulders. She returned his salute with slow, deliberate grace, acknowledging his respect. She didn't stay for the rest of the reception. She turned and walked toward the exit, her head held high, the silver stars on her shoulders gleaming in the light. She was not walking out into the cold alone. As she pushed the heavy brass doors open, Arthur was right beside her. He slipped a warm coat over her shoulders, his presence an unwavering anchor. They walked out into the cool evening air together, leaving the battlefield behind, stepping forward into a future where she was finally seen, finally valued, and profoundly loved. The cool, crisp evening air of Alexandria felt like a physical balm against Sarah's heated skin as she stepped out of the suffocating atmosphere of the plaza. For the first time in her entire adult life, her shoulders were not braced for an impending emotional impact. The invisible, crushing weight of her family's expectations, their constant belittling, and her own desperate yearning for their approval had been left behind in that ballroom, shattered alongside her sister's crystal champagne flute. Dr. Arthur Vance walked right beside her, his presence an unwavering anchor in the chaotic aftermath of the evening. He had draped his heavy wool overcoat around her shoulders, and the residual warmth of it seeped into her bones, chasing away the chill of a lifetime of rejection. They did not speak immediately. They simply walked away from the flashing lights of the venue, the rhythmic sound of their footsteps on the pavement serving as a quiet testament to their shared escape. When they finally reached Arthur's car, he opened the door for her, his eyes reflecting a deep, unconditional respect that Sarah was still trying to process. As he drove them away from the affluent, toxic enclave of the country club, the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was profoundly restorative. Sarah looked out the window at the passing city lights, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from her system. For 2 decades, she had operated on high alert, treating her family home as a hostile environment where she had to carefully navigate emotional minefields. Now looking at the steady, calm profile of the man sitting beside her, she realized the war was finally over. She did not have to buy her way into this car. She did not have to hide her rank, her scars, or her trauma. Arthur had seen the absolute worst of her family's cruelty, and he had stood up to shield her from it. That night, sitting in a quiet, dimly lit diner sipping black coffee with a man who looked at her as if she hung the moon, Sarah took her first real breath of freedom. 6 months later, the stark, sterile apartment that Sarah used to call home was a thing of the past. She had retired from active military duty, trading the high-stakes environment of international logistics for a different, deeply personal kind of mission. She now lived in a beautiful, sunlit house on the outskirts of the city, a home filled with warmth, thriving green plants, and the soft, inviting scent of burning cedar and fresh coffee. There were no imported white orchids or velvet ropes here. Every item in her home was chosen for comfort and genuine joy. Her mornings were no longer defined by dread or the ringing of an answering machine carrying her mother's demands for money. Instead, she woke up to the sound of birds outside her window and the comforting presence of Arthur, who had become her steadfast partner in every sense of the word. Their relationship was built on a foundation of mutual maturity, shared trauma recovery, and profound emotional safety. He loved the woman in the uniform just as much as he loved the woman in oversized sweatpants reading a book on the porch. Sarah's new life was not just about quiet retirement. It was about channeling her pain into profound purpose. She had taken the remainder of her hazard pay, the money her mother had so desperately tried to drain, and founded a non-profit organization dedicated to the mental health and financial protection of returning servicewomen. The foundation provided legal counsel, financial literacy programs, and trauma-informed therapy for female veterans who found themselves exploited or alienated by their own civilian families upon returning home. Sarah spent her days surrounded by women who understood the exact weight of her sacrifices. She was no longer an invisible guardian standing in the shadows. She was a visible, celebrated leader of a community that valued her humanity above all else. She had finally found her true family, not forged by blood or obligation, but by loyalty, shared resilience, and an unwavering commitment to lifting each other up. The auditorium was bathed in warm, golden light as Sarah stepped up to the polished oak podium. The room was filled with hundreds of women veterans, advocates, and survivors of familial abuse. She looked out at the sea of faces, her heart swelling with a profound sense of belonging. She was not wearing her dress blues today. She wore a soft, elegant civilian blazer, her posture still impeccably straight, but her energy radiating warmth rather than defensive rigidity. Arthur sat in the front row, his eyes shining with unmistakable pride. Sarah took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly into the camera, recording the event at the back of the room. It was time to share the truth that had taken her a lifetime to learn, a truth she knew millions of other women desperately needed to hear. For a very long time, I believed a lie that many of us are taught from a young age, Sir began, her voice steady and resonant, carrying effortlessly through the hushed room. I believed that if I just gave enough, bled enough, and sacrificed enough of my own well-being, the people who were supposed to love me finally would. I thought that my worth was a currency I had to earn. I spent years transferring my hard-earned resources, both financial and emotional, into a bottomless pit of familial expectation. I allowed myself to be hidden in the shadows, to be minimized, and to be treated as a walking bank account. All because I was terrified of being cast out by the people who shared my blood. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the audience. But respect and love cannot be bought, and they certainly cannot be earned from people who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding you. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't on a battlefield under enemy fire. It was in a ballroom surrounded by polite society. True equality, human dignity, and self-love mean recognizing that your worth is inherent. It is woven into your very existence. You do not have to shrink yourself to make other people comfortable. You do not have to hide your stars, your achievements, or your scars just because they clash with someone else's fragile, superficial ego. We all deserve relationships that are built on mutual respect and genuine compassion. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, empathy, and unconditional respect make you a family. Sarah leaned slightly forward, her gaze intensifying, speaking directly to the women who were still trapped in the cycle she had escaped. If you are watching this, and you are the bank for a toxic family, I need you to listen to me carefully. If you are the one they hide in the shadows until they need something from you, if you are the one funding their masquerades while they tear down your self-esteem, stop. Financial abuse wrapped in a guy familial obligation is still abuse. You owe absolutely nothing to those who continually devalue your humanity. You have the right to pack up your bags, walk out of the room, and never look back. Walking away from toxicity is not a failure. It is the ultimate victory of self-preservation. A profound, resonant silence hung in the air before the room erupted into a standing ovation. As the applause washed over her, Sarah looked at the camera one last time, offering a gentle, knowing smile. If you have ever had to walk away from a table where respect was no longer being served, I want you to comment the word "worthy" down below. Let's build a community of women who recognize their own unparalleled value. Please like this video to help spread this message to someone who might really need to hear it today. And subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your life, setting boundaries, and finding true healing. Until next time, keep your head high, keep your heart open, and never forget exactly how much you are worth. The morning sun poured generously through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sentinel Foundation's headquarters, bathing the bustling office in a warm, golden glow. The space was a stark contrast to the sterile, oppressive environment Sarah had navigated for most of her life. Here, the walls were painted in soothing earth tones, adorned with vibrant artwork created by the very veterans the foundation served. There was a constant, comforting hum of activity phones ringing softly, the low murmur of empathetic conversations, and the occasional burst of genuine, uninhibited laughter. Sarah sat behind her heavy oak desk, reviewing a grant proposal that would fund a new wing of transitional housing for female soldiers. She wore a simple, beautifully tailored cashmere sweater, her posture relaxed but still carrying the undeniable grace of a woman who knew exactly who she was. She was deeply engrossed in the budget breakdown when her executive assistant, a fiercely intelligent former Marine named Maya, knocked gently on the open door. Maya held a small, cream-colored envelope that looked entirely out of place amidst the stack of official government documents and legal briefs on her clipboard. Sarah looked up, offering a warm smile that faded slightly as she noticed the heavy, embossed texture of the stationery. Maya stepped into the office, her expression tight with protective concern. She placed the envelope on the center of the desk. There was no return address, but the looping, immaculate cursive ink spelling out Sarah's name was unmistakable. It was the handwriting of a woman who had spent more time signing checks for country club charity galas than writing to her own daughter. It was from Eleanor. For a fleeting second, the old conditioned response flared in Sarah's chest, a sudden tightening of the lungs, the phantom echo of a mother's condescending sigh, the instinct to brace for an emotional blow. But the reaction lasted only a moment. Sarah took a deep, steadying breath, grounding herself in the present reality of her sunlit office and the life she had painstakingly built. She picked up a silver letter opener and sliced the thick paper, pulling out a single, heavily perfumed page. The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation, woven with desperate attempts at emotional extortion. Eleanor detailed, with a tragic tone, how her social standing in Alexandria had evaporated overnight, following the disastrous wedding reception. General Sterling had made it his personal mission to ensure that the aristocratic circles of the East Coast knew exactly what kind of people the Harrisons were. Victoria's engagement to James had been formally and publicly terminated the very next morning, leaving Victoria a pariah in the only world she cared about. Eleanor's invitations to the elite galas had dried up. Her credit lines were heavily strained without Sarah's hazard pay to secretly float their extravagant lifestyle, and the walls of their massive, empty house were closing in on them. The letter did not contain a single genuine apology. Instead, it was framed as a plea for family unity, suggesting that it was time for Sarah to be the bigger person and issue a public statement of reconciliation to salvage the family's reputation. Eleanor even boldly suggested that Sarah could offer Victoria a high-paying administrative position at her new foundation to help her get back on her feet. Sarah read the words twice, searching her own heart for any lingering trace of the desperate, eager to please girl who used to wire her combat bonuses just to earn a fake smile. She found absolutely nothing. There was no anger, no blazing fury, and certainly no desire for vengeance. The only emotion that washed over her was a profound, chilling pity. She was looking at the desperate flailing of a woman who had invested her entire soul into the hollow currency of social perception, leaving her completely bankrupt in every way that truly mattered. Dr. Arthur Vance walked into the office just as Sarah finished the letter. He took one look at the embossed paper and the slight rigidity in Sarah's shoulders and immediately knew the source of the intrusion. He walked around the desk, standing behind her, and gently rested his warm, heavy hands on her shoulders. He didn't ask what the letter said. He simply kissed the top of her head and waited, offering his silent, unshakable support. Sarah leaned back into his touch, her muscles relaxing instantly. Without a word, she folded the perfumed letter back into a perfect square. She did not draft a reply. She did not call her mother to argue or explain her boundaries. She calmly leaned over to the industrial shredder beside her desk and fed the thick cream paper into the machine. The mechanical wear obliterated the last physical tie to her toxic past, shredding the manipulation into thousands of unrecognizable pieces. She looked up at Arthur, her eyes clear and impossibly bright, and smiled. The ghost had finally been laid to rest. The rugged, breathtaking coastline of Maine provided a dramatic, windswept backdrop for a celebration that was everything Victoria's sterile. Opulent country club wedding had not been. There were no velvet ropes, no crystal chandeliers, and certainly no carefully curated seating charts designed to hide the undesirable guests in the shadows. Instead, the air smelled of salt spray, wild pine, and the rich, smoky aroma of a massive bonfire crackling on the rocky beach. Strings of warm, glowing fairy lights were draped through the branches of the ancient cedar trees, casting a soft, golden illumination over the small gathering of 50 people. These were not politicians or hedge fund managers looking to network. These were the people who had earned their place in Sarah's life through loyalty, shared sacrifice, and unconditional love. There were women from the Sentinel Foundation, nurses who had held Sarah's hand through agonizing physical therapy, and brothers in arms who had flown across the country simply to see their commander finally step into the light. Sarah stood on a wooden deck overlooking the crashing waves of the Atlantic, adjusting the delicate lace sleeves of her wedding dress. It was a simple, elegant ivory gown that moved beautifully with the ocean breeze, completely devoid of heavy, restrictive fabrics or ostentatious jewels. She wore no veil, allowing her hair to fall softly around her shoulders, framing the faint, jagged scar on her jawline that she no longer felt the need to hide with heavy makeup. It was a mark of survival, a testament to her strength. And today, it was simply a part of the woman Arthur Vance loved. A soft knock on the wooden doorframe drew her attention. Captain James Sterling stood there, dressed in a sharp civilian suit, holding a small bouquet of wild blue hydrangeas. Over the past year and a half, James had become a fixture in Sarah and Arthur's life, transforming from a soldier bound by an unspoken life debt into a genuine, fiercely protective younger brother figure. He offered her the flowers with a warm, reverent smile, his eyes shining with unwept tears. He extended his arm, an offering to walk her down the short, grassy aisle toward the man waiting for her. As Sarah linked her arm through James's, a profound sense of peace settled over her. The string quartet did not play a grand, overwhelming march. They played a soft, acoustic melody that blended perfectly with the sound of the ocean. When she stepped out into the clearing, the small crowd stood up, their faces reflecting nothing but absolute joy and profound respect. And at the end of the aisle stood Arthur. He was looking at her as if she were the only person existing in the universe. There was no hesitation in his stance, no hidden agendas in his warm brown eyes. When James gently handed her over, Arthur took both of her calloused hands in his thumbs lightly tracing the scars she had earned in the desert. The ceremony was short, intimate, and deeply personal. They did not exchange traditional vows written by someone else. They spoke from the raw, beautiful architecture of their shared history. Arthur promised to always be her safe harbor, to stand beside her in the trenches of life, and to honor the fierce, brilliant woman who had fought so hard to find her own worth. When it was Sarah's turn, her voice was steady, carrying the weight of a woman who had crossed oceans of grief to find this exact moment. She looked into the eyes of the man who had seen her at her most broken, bleeding on a surgical table, and at her most humiliated, sitting in the shadows of a ballroom, and who had never once looked away. She promised to let down her armor, to allow herself to be softly, deeply loved, and to build a life with him grounded in truth and unwavering mutual respect. When they finally kissed, the small crowd erupted into genuine, deafening cheers that echoed over the roaring ocean. Later that night, as Sarah danced under the stars with her husband, surrounded by the beautiful, chosen family she had built from the ground up, she looked out at the dark expanse of the water. She was no longer the invisible guardian bleeding for people who despised her. She was a woman standing fully in her own power, entirely worthy of the magnificent, peaceful life she was living. She rested her head against Arthur's chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart, and knew with absolute certainty that the war was over, and she had finally, truly come home. The Sentinel Foundation had grown from a passionate concept into a formidable sanctuary in the span of just 3 years. Located in a beautifully restored brick building on the historic outskirts of Alexandria, the facility was designed to feel like a home rather than an institution. The walls were painted in soft, calming shades of sage and warm ivory, and the air always carried the faint, comforting aroma of roasted coffee and fresh cedar. Sarah Harrison, now deeply settled into her civilian life, walked through the sunlit corridors with a sense of purpose that felt entirely different from the hyper-vigilant adrenaline of her military days. She was no longer a soldier bracing for an ambush. She was an architect of healing, guiding other women out of the very darkness she had once called home. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the weight of her mission felt especially profound as she sat across from a young woman in one of the private counseling rooms. The young woman, a 24-year-old combat medic named Chloe, sat with her shoulders hunched forward, her eyes fixed firmly on her scuffed boots. Chloe's story was a painful, agonizingly familiar echo of Sarah's own past. She had returned from a brutal deployment in the Middle East with a decorated service record and a severe case of post-traumatic stress. Instead of finding a safe harbor, Chloe had returned to a family that viewed her combat pay and disability benefits as a communal slush fund. Her parents had guilt-tripped her into paying off their massive credit card debts, while simultaneously criticizing her for being too edgy and socially awkward at family gatherings. The breaking point had come when her mother demanded Chloe co-sign a predatory loan for her brother's failing business, threatening to cut her out of the family entirely if she refused. As listened to the young medic's trembling voice, she saw the exact reflection of the girl she used to be, the desperate, exhausted daughter, who believed that purchasing her family's comfort was the only way to validate her own existence. Sarah did not interrupt. She let Chloe pour out every ounce of her guilt, her fear, and her devastating sense of betrayal, offering the profound, silent validation that only someone who had survived the same war could provide. When Chloe finally fell silent, wiping a stray tear from her cheek, Sarah leaned forward. She didn't offer clinical platitudes or generic therapy speak. She reached out and gently placed her calloused, scarred hand over Chloe's trembling fingers. "You feel like you are betraying them," Sarah said, her voice soft but anchored in absolute certainty. "You feel like if you just give them this one last thing, maybe they will finally look at you and see your worth. Maybe they will finally love you the way you need to be loved." Chloe choked out a sob, nodding frantically, completely undone by the terrifying accuracy of Sarah's words. Sarah squeezed her hand, her eyes locked onto the young woman's tear-filled gaze. "I know that exact feeling. Chloe, I lived inside that exact nightmare for 20 years. I bled for people who were embarrassed by my scars. But I need you to hear me right now. And I need you to believe it as fiercely as you believed in your training. You cannot buy respect. You cannot finance unconditional love. And you are not a bad daughter for refusing to be a casualty of their greed." The words hung in the quiet room, heavy with truth. Sarah walked Chloe through the excruciating but necessary steps of financial independence. She helped her freeze her bank accounts, set up a secure trust, and draft a firm, uncompromising letter of boundary to her parents. It was a terrifying process for the young medic, but as the afternoon wore on, Sarah watched the physical transformation take place. Chloe's spine straightened just a fraction. The defensive hunch of her shoulders began to relax. By the time Chloe left the office, clutching a folder of legal protections and a referral to the Foundation's trauma-informed therapist, she looked like a soldier who had finally been given permission to set down a 100-pound rucksack, watching her walk away. Sarah felt a profound, sweeping sense of closure. The agonizing years she had spent, trapped in Eleanor and Victoria's toxic web, had not been entirely in vain. That pain had been transformed into a beacon. She had weaponized her own survival to ensure that the next generation of women would not have to fight the same invisible, suffocating war. She turned off the lights in the counseling room, feeling a deep, abiding peace in her soul, and went home to the beautiful life she had built with the man who had helped her find the light. The wooden porch of their coastal Maine sanctuary was bathed in the cool, twilight hues of deep violet and bruised orange as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. The rhythmic, powerful crash of the waves against the jagged black rocks was a sound Sarah Vance had come to associate with absolute freedom. She sat in a heavy Adirondack chair, a thick woolen blanket draped over her legs, cradling a mug of steaming chamomile tea. Arthur sat right beside her, his chair pulled close enough that their shoulders touched. He was reading a medical journal, the soft amber glow of the porch light catching the silver strands in his dark hair. There were no ringing phones, no frantic emails demanding wire transfers, and no suffocating layers of social pretense to navigate. There was only the vast, majestic expanse of the sea in the quiet, unshakable certainty of a love that required absolutely no performance. Arthur reached over, blindly finding her hand in the dim light, and intertwined his fingers with hers. He didn't look up from his reading. It was simply a quiet, continuous affirmation of his presence. Sarah squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with a gratitude so immense it almost brought tears to her eyes. She looked out at the dark water, taking a long, deep breath of the salt-heavy air. As the evening deepened, the narrative of Sarah's journey transcended her own personal healing, expanding into a universal truth that she knew she had to share. In the quiet solitude of that porch, looking directly into the metaphorical lens of her own history, Sarah offered her final reflection, a desperate, passionate plea to any woman still trapped in the shadows of a toxic bloodline. We are taught from the very beginning that family is the ultimate sanctuary, she began, her voice steady, carrying the resonant authority of a woman who had survived the fire and emerged as steel. We are conditioned to believe that blood dictates loyalty, and that it is our moral obligation to set ourselves on fire simply to keep our relatives warm. But I am here to tell you that human rights, equality, and basic human dignity do not disappear the moment you walk through the front door of your childhood home. You have the fundamental right to be treated with respect, and that right does not carry an exemption clause for your mother, your father, or your siblings. Abuse is abuse, whether it happens in a corporate boardroom on a city street, or under the glow of a crystal chandelier at a family dinner. Her tone shifted, dropping into a register of profound, unwavering empathy. If you are the one carrying the financial and emotional weight of a family that only acknowledges you when they need your resources, if you are the one they hide away because your truth, your trauma, or your sheer brilliance threatens their fragile masquerade, here this warning. Financial extortion wrapped in the velvet ribbon of family duty is designed to keep you powerless. They will drain your bank accounts. They will drain your empathy. And they will drain your life force, all while convincing you that you are the one failing them. Stop trying to earn a seat at a table where the only thing on the menu is your own destruction. The most terrifying, revolutionary thing you can do is to push back your chair, stand up, and walk out the door. The moment you stop funding their illusions, the moment you stop absorbing their cruelty, they will starve. And in that silence, you will finally hear your own voice. The ocean wind picked up, rustling the pines surrounding the cabin, but Sarah's focus remained laser-sharp, delivering her final call to action. You are not a bad person for choosing your own survival. You are not a failure for demanding that your humanity be recognized. True family is an architecture built on mutual respect, unwavering empathy, and unconditional love. It is a structure you have the power to choose. and a structure you have the power to build from the ground up. If you have ever been the invisible guardian in your own home, if you have ever had to execute the agonizing courage to walk away from people who shared your blood but despised your spirit, I want you to go to the comments right now and type the word worthy. Let us fill that space with a testament to our inherent value. Let us show the world that we will no longer be hidden in the corners. Please like this video so the algorithm can push this message to the woman sitting in the dark right now, wondering if she has the strength to leave. Subscribe to this channel. Join this community of unbroken women. And together, we will continue to reclaim our lives. Stay strong, protect your peace, and never, ever forget your worth. As we reach the end of Sarah's journey, the echoes of her story leave us with a profound truth. So many of us are taught from childhood that family is the ultimate sanctuary, that we must endure endless disrespect, financial drain, and emotional manipulation simply because the people hurting us share our last name. We shrink ourselves. We hide our accomplishments. We endure the backhanded compliments and the intentional isolation, hoping that if we just give enough of our resources and our hearts, they will finally see our worth. But Sarah's triumph in that ballroom wasn't just about exposing a lie. It was about the revolutionary act of realizing she didn't need their applause. You cannot finance unconditional love, and you cannot negotiate your basic human dignity with people who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding you. If you find yourself constantly pushed into the shadows of your own life to make a toxic family member shine, remember this: your worth is inherent. Walking away from a table where respect is no longer served isn't a failure. It is an act of profound self-preservation. You have the absolute right to build a family from the ground up, a chosen family built on mutual respect, deep empathy, and shared resilience. You are allowed to take off the heavy armor, step into the light, and demand to be valued for exactly who you are. Never let anyone, especially your own blood, convince you that you belong in the dark. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by us to bring meaning and lessons.